Thank you very much. I'm always very nervous of asking if people can hear me, because I had a friend who went to Australia and he went halfway through a presentation and suddenly forgot, and he said, "Can everyone hear me?" And some chap at the front said, "Yes, I can, but I'll be very happy to swap with someone who can't." So I think the idea of my presentation, following from Toby and Tony's excellent introductions there, was to try and bring this on to something on a more practical level of behavioural insights, because I'm actually speaking to you today on behalf of the Equine Disease Coalition, and we're starting down a journey around behavioural insights, around the focus around biosecurity and equine biosecurity. And so I'd have to say we're still fairly early in that journey, but hopefully some of what I'll say will resonate across the species. I should apologise. I did basic training in the army, and I was always told I only have 3 or 4 key points on slides. Some of my slides are a little like a train crash, and I apologise like that. The army always told you to say 3 things in a presentation. Say what you're going to say it, and then say what you've said. So, but I'm not going to do that. I think it was a short way of making presentations easier to write. It reminds me of a commanding officer who said, "Never give me something to do on a Wednesday lunchtime." And I said, "Why so?" He said, "Messes up both weekends." So, what am I going to talk about? Not my time in the army. I just want to do an introduction to the Equine Disease Coalition, talk about equine biosecurity, what do we mean by it and what's the problem, to explore what we've done with Toby and the Behavioural Insights team so far, to talk about the next steps, and then maybe a small challenge to us all. The Equine Disease Coalition itself was established back in 2011, and it followed on from a very good non-government partnership around African horse sickness, chaired by Paul Jepson, and it brought in the African horse sickness control strategy and the SI that goes with that. And so it was a very good day. Those were the halcyon days when government had money, and there was real engagement. But there is still real engagement. It's obviously just the environment in which we work is very different. And it's sought to get representation, veterinary representation from across the piece. So government, both local, central, including devolved administrations, integral to that. Clearly, the Animal Health Trust has such an important role to play here. And then a variety of other veterinary schools and charities make up that. And what have we done so far? Many of you will be very aware that consultation seems to be order of the day as far as the government's concerned, and all natures of government. And there's not. I think there's about 4 or 5 from an equine perspective going on right now, and the Equine Disease Coalition has played its part in supporting some of those. We produced back in 2013, I think, the Equine Health Checklist, which was very much the driver of what I'm talking to you about today. And I think I'm biased, of course, but I will talk about what information about biosecurity is out there. But I think this is one of the best in terms of content. I stress in terms of content. I think this is a very, very good overview. And for those of you who have got a bit of a BVA history, you might notice that we did steal somewhat the format from the BVA's responsible antimicrobial campaign a few years back. Most recently, the Equine Disease Coalition was the driver of bringing in new control measures for contagious equine metritis. This was on the back of, you may remember a few years back, the government's red tape challenge to get rid of legislation, I think like all similar types of legislation or initiatives, rather like, I think it was, what was it? I can't remember what they're called. It's not state. What are the non-governmental bodies called? Quangos. Yeah, but yeah, it's bonfire of quangos, which ends up creating more quangos than it started with. And I think it's similar with legislation. But government really wanted to get rid of equine viral arthritis and contagious equine metritis from the notifiable disease register. The sector pushed back very firmly, but we did commit to trying to rebalance the responsibility between government and horse owner in disease outbreak. And that recently came into play across the three countries, Scotland, England and Wales, which is brilliant. But then more recently, we've got involved in these behavioural insights work around biosecurity. So what do we mean by biosecurity? And I think this is one of the biggest challenges when we're talking to horse owners and anyone involved in the equine world and far wider. As I think many people would think biosecurity is people in white suits recently seen on Salisbury High Street. They have a completely different view on what it really means, when all it really means is the steps we take to prevent disease. It couldn't be simpler, but we do make it awfully complicated. I'm not sure it's best practice, but I'd like to think it is good practice. At World Horse Welfare, we have 4 rescue and rehoming centres around the country, and we follow a risk-based approach to animals that come into our care. And clearly, as we know, isolation is a really important part of that. But you have to be proportionate. We have 1,800 horses out in homes around the country, and because of the nature of the scheme, a lot of those, 10% of those, will come back each year to go off to new homes. So clearly, animals coming from places like that pose generally a lower risk than ones that we're taking in from welfare cases in conjunction with other charities, sometimes from the moors of Wales or England or wherever it be. So you need to take a proportionate approach. But I think one of the greatest challenges we face around biosecurity is that people think, unless you can do it all, there's no point doing any of it, and which nothing could be further from the truth. So even if we just get people to, when new horses come onto yards, to put them into a different fields where they have no contact with the other residents for at least a week, but hopefully longer, then you're going to really improve your level of biosecurity. And of course, veterinary health records are fundamentally important, and especially with prosecution cases, but not just prosecution cases, indeed all. So what is the problem? When we started looking at this, back in 2013, there was some information from the Keep Britain's Horses Healthy initiative that showed about 530,000 doses of equine influenza were sold that year. Now, obviously, a lot of those will be multiple to one animal. And when we've got over 1 million animals, as we did back in 2013, you can see that our level of vaccination for equine influenza is considerably less than 50%. And we reckon it's somewhere between 30 and 40%. We know that strangles is still endemic in this country, driven in many parts by really poor levels of biosecurity. And it's obviously not that long ago when we had the outbreak of equine infectious anemia, and that was brought about by animals that were imported from Romania. So you can see that the disease threat is there, and it's so often brought about by poor standards and poor behaviour with regards to biosecurity. And if you look at these two surveys, they're not directly comparable, but the Livery Yard survey run nearly a decade ago shows that there were no procedures in 40% of cases to exclude horses with disease, something that we would hope that many of us would view as just really basic. But even when we look at Red Wing survey far more recently, there was no strangles screening for new arrivals, and indeed over a third of people thought that strangles was an airborne disease. Now, as I'll come on to in a second, we're undertaking a new survey guided by the Behavioural Insights team, and that will, I've got some early results of that, but it's still running. So, around biosecurity, is there information out there? In England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there are codes of practice for the keeping of equidae. And part of those basic codes talks about basic healthcare and how to be aware of and what steps to take with illness, animals that are suffering from disease. So that's, at a top line level. Then you only have to look at different organisations, including government, but also veterinary practice, also charities, also pharmaceutical companies. There is a plethora of information out there, and some really, really good information. So I think when we come to talking about content of trying to educate not just horse owners, but farriers and vets and all stakeholders within the equine sector, there's plenty of out there that we can get our teeth into. But are horse owners aware of it? You've just seen that over a third of horse owners think strangles is an airborne disease. So I think we can very surely say that horse owners, if they're are aware of it, they're certainly not understanding it and are even less likely to use it. So that's why when we were looking at this last year, and it was suggested actually by DEFRA to get the behavioural insights team in. And so last year, Toby came on a journey with us, and I know he's done some work with DEFRA separately, but I think he's found the equine world illuminating, is the term he used. So what have we done? We've run 2 workshops. The first we ran last September in London, and then one up in just outside Glasgow in last month. And we tried to get together a real good cross-section. Each workshop had about 20 people, and we looked at getting both government and non-government involvement in that. Both practicing vets, both livery yard owners, people involved in all facets of the equine sector. And at each group day, we had 4 breakout groups, and which used this sort of test methodology, which was an extension of what Toby was talking around now, around targeting, exploring, identifying a solution and then trialling that. And so in terms of putting that, and I apologize, this is a very, very busy slide, but you'll see, out of this, there was no sort of pre-briefing to the groups, and although the groups were in the two events were in the same room, they worked on it individually. So there was certainly no plagiarism here, but not surprisingly, they've come up with a huge amount of overlap. Strangles clearly had a very important part in many groups. Equine influenza, also generic contagious disease issues. So you can see that there was a great similarity between these target objectives that the groups thought out. And they basically put, as what Toby has talked about already, this East framework into action. And it was fascinating to see during the day, Toby would stop. I mean, obviously what he did just now was the first hour, and then he would take us through the framework as we went. So going through each stage, ending up with that trial phase. And it obviously identified a number of solutions. Now, in all honesty, none of the solutions identified are going to be the golden bullet, but it was more to educate us as a sector to see what the potential was around behavioural insights. Because I think what we know is that, as I've already said, the information is out there, it's clearly not getting through to those that need to implement it. And I think, why is that? I think we know from across the animal health sector is that in peacetime, people will not invest, and it sort of obviously probably relates to the insurance discussion we had this morning. People will generally not invest the required amount of time in biosecurity, but sure as hell, when strangles hits, it's amazing how yards suddenly implement the best biosecurity in the land for so long, and then it begins to wane. So in these solutions, we really do need to identify what is practical. And just to look at a couple of those solutions that came up. One around strangles, which was to see a 50% increase in uptake of strangle tests in the UK by 2020. What would seem a really reasonable objective and very, very clear. And you can hopefully see whatever you think about the practicalities of it, but it's very targeted. It's very clear what it wants to do. And one of the solutions was around to include on the PPE form a tick box for whether a strangles test has been undertaken. So it's a very good audit process too. And then another one in Scotland was around just a very simple as saying when you enter a competition, the fact that you have to tick a box to say that your horse has come from a yard or from a stable where there is no contagious disease present. Now, obviously, we can all pick holes in that, but I thought it was a very good example about how actually as a sector we need to stand up and take responsibility. So that was a really good start. But I think what we recognised was that, 20 people, or 40 if you take the two workshops together, the equine sector is a lot bigger than that. And we really didn't have enough people from grassroots, from people who were horse owners in livery yards, in private stables. We needed to get that out much more widely. And the other thing that Toby was very clear about is that you have to have a clear idea of the facts of the situation, because whatever solution you implement, you've got to monitor and evaluate it, because there are so many interventions which have had completely the opposite intention of what they meant. And I think I'm delighted that Toby didn't steal it. The best one he came up with was this operation called Scared Straight, which was an initiative started in the States and then swept across Europe, including the UK, where young convicts who had come out of jail would go into school and tell young children, 13, 14-year-olds, why they didn't want to make the same mistake that they did and mess up their lives by ending up in prison. And so, it got lots of great press and across the piece, until someone did some research and found out that children were 6% more likely to commit a felony if they had been part of the interaction than if they hadn't. And I can just imagine it, my son coming home, God, brilliant, Dad. This chap in an orange boiler suit came home and told me about, you can see it happening. So you've got to ensure whatever we do is really going to have the impact it's going to have. So what have we done as a result? We've undertaken a survey which is now live, and what Toby has encouraged us to do is to look at this overall behaviour that we're looking to interact, which obviously in our case is around equine infectious disease. So look at an overall behaviour you're seeking to target, and then look at the macro level and at the micro level of where those interventions might have an impact. So we've looked at it a series of categories, and you won't be able to see them, but from vaccinations and testing and isolation. So we've looked at a number of categories and then looked at the points each at a macro and a micro level. And that's what the survey is all about. It's currently live, and I'll ask the team at Animal Welfare Foundation to put this link up. So it's going to be live till the end of June. It says that you can get, if you fill it in, you stand a chance, as we know, 1 in 1,000 at the moment, of getting a free pair of welly boots. But they're not just welly boots, they're Ariat boots, are retailing at £140. What better incentive there is than that? But then from the survey results, we're going to do some focus groups led by the Behavioural Insights team, and then we will look to put that pilot out into whatever audience, because obviously what we haven't identified here is what audience we're going to focus on, whether it be horse owners themselves, or vets, or farriers, or who else, or all of the above. And then obviously we will evaluate that trial. So it's an exciting journey of which we're in a fairly early stage. I thought, if I referred you back to my earlier comment, that between 30 and 40% of the equine herd in the UK is vaccinated against influenza. We've done really well, because we found a group where 90% of them are vaccinated against influenza. So I think it potentially may show that either people are not being totally truthful, maybe their horse had an influenza vaccine about 10 years ago, or the fact that we've got a very different subset of the population, and we'll need to look out about that. But even so, 90% vaccinate against influenza, over half considered biosecurity control measures as not necessary. So I think that shows, even in this audience, we've got a huge challenge on ourselves. But it also shows what role vets play, because 90% would look to their vets for information on disease control. So there's a great opportunity there too. So I think in terms of a challenge, I think the veterinary profession and the allied professionals have a huge role to play in improving biosecurity. As vets, when was the last time outside a disease outbreak that we had a proper conversation with our clients around biosecurity and making those small steps to improve levels of biosecurity, even on top competition yards. How good an example do we set but when we're going, especially on livery yards, when we go to one animal to another and do not wash our hands? These small steps to show that biosecurity is really important. So I think we've got to, as a profession, really take a strong look at ourselves and say, are our biosecurity standards fit for purpose? And I think in some cases we may find they're not. I'd just like to say thank you very much to the team at the Equine Disease Coalition, the British Horse Council and Wales Horse Welfare, but especially to Toby and also Caroline Hodgkinson, who's a PhD student at the Animal Health Trust, who's been hugely helpful through this whole process. Thank you for listening. I'm very happily taking any questions.